discussion. So just for the recording, I'm Neil Chadbourne, and this is a presentation about getting research into practice, making your evidence do stuff, go places, and what we might call impact. And impact has a growing agenda over the last 10 years or 20 years. And that's both for the health research world, National Institute of Health Research, for example, and also for universities and academics. It was traditionally not emphasised, shall I say, or wasn't a priority. So it's a new priority. And then this moves into other terms such as implementation, and I'll try and describe that. So just a few words of introduction. I'm a research fellow at the University of Nottingham, and I'm interested in health services and community services, public health, particularly for older people and people with dementia. So hopefully you can see my slides, and so we've done the introduction. So here's a little word cloud type thing that I put together with some of these terms on, and I'm not going to go into all of these, just to give you an idea that this area of work that I'm discussing this afternoon has lots of different names, different people mean different things by it, and it's generally confusing. I forget now what the title of Emma's talk that she's giving in a couple of weeks' time, but there's implementation science, there's improvement, there's quality improvement, evidence-based practice. All these terms mean slightly different things to different people. Some people mean different things by the same term, and these can all be challenging issues. The main point is to, when we think of traditional academic science, we think of a kind of ivory tower, which is quite separate from real world practice. And most of these topics aim to greater communication between the two, to convey the work of the academics to people in practice, and vice versa, communicate from practice to academics. So that's the main thing that we're getting across. I'm going to start with where we left off in my previous session about qualitative research, to try and explore a sort of critical perspective of how we think about the evidence that we produce from our research in terms of the aim of changing practice or changing policy. There's a whole area of implementation science, which is a study in itself, which I won't get so much into this afternoon. So I should just expand these slides, shouldn't I? So to give you an outline of what I hope to cover today, we'll start with a kind of simple idea that there are a group of academics producing knowledge, and there's a group of practitioners and policymakers who are using knowledge or making use of knowledge. So we kind of quite a simple categorization of different groups of people and what they do. That's, as I said, simple, and I'll go on to explore whether we can think of that in a more critical way, in a more complex way, by thinking a bit more, what do we actually mean by evidence? Does it mean different things to different people? How is evidence valued? And what if knowledge users were equally involved in producing knowledge? So maybe it's more of a two-way thing. And the kind of point of this is to say that objectivity of evidence, objectivity in science isn't the be-all and end-all. And this comes back to some of the things that I was discussing with the qualitative research. in that qualitative is often subjective or contextual, and has an understanding of practices in a way that objective knowledge struggles to do. So we may be able to have a more nuanced discussion of what we mean by knowledge, and what we mean by sharing knowledge, implementation of knowledge, etc. So we'll come on to that. Great. Okay. So coming back to this kind of reductionist, I might call it reductionist approach to knowledge translation or impact, this sort of, you know, might be a caricature, but I'll go for it anyway. Top left here, we've got a magnifying glass to signify the academic or the expert who goes out and to find a problem. So that's often given as the first part of the story. The academic identifies a problem, and therefore they design a study to try and explore that problem, or to test a solution to that problem, if you like. And there's the scientific method, results and conclusions that we write up in a scientific report. So that's a way of testing a solution to that problem, and it comes up with scientific conclusions. Then there's a couple of magic arrows in this diagram. The first one turns these scientific conclusions into recommendations, and we don't quite know how that works, but it does happen. Recommendations might be towards policy, designed for policymakers, or might turn into guidance, for example, for practitioners. Then there's another kind of magic arrow, the yellow one, which I'm going to sort of emphasize this afternoon, which is about moving those recommendations into practice, so they actually do things in the real world. They bring about change, either in practice or resourcing or other changes. And again, that's a simplification. We don't quite know how that works, and that's what all implementation science is about, understanding that process. So I don't know whether anyone wants to shout out any problems that they foresee with this kind of simplistic idea of things. Anyone like to unmute and shout out, or type in the text? So one initial idea, you know, coming back to my first comments, was that if the experts are kind of separate from the people doing the practice, they may have a different view on things. Anna Maria, were you going to say something?
I think, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm a social worker, full-time social worker, so I think there's huge gaps there with consultation with, you know, practitioners, service providers, you know, and service users, families, you know, whoever we're working with. So that's the gap I can see.
Yeah, excellent. And I think you've sort of touched upon a couple of different issues there. One is different disciplines working together, I think you're hinting at. Yeah. And the other is involving users, and obviously the aim of any kind of research project, and certainly in health and social care, is for benefit to the end user, service user, member of the public, etc. Suzille in the chat mentioned onus is always on academics, and they may be removed somewhat from the field they are observing. So exactly, speaking as an academic, I agree with that. Rachel, agree, not that simple on the front line if academics don't understand how things really are or work. So these are some of the real challenges that an academic like myself, I'm not a clinician or a practitioner, that sort of everyday experience working with clients, service users, etc., gives you insights that myself as an academic don't have. So that's one key issue, and that goes for the two ends of the process: the identification of problems. Now, who's best to identify or prioritize a problem? And those go hand in hand, don't they? It may be, Tamara says it may be difficult to implement something nationally as problems may be slightly different in different areas of the country or the world. Yeah, that's a real key issue, and we kind of, there's a couple of points here. One is we want to find local solutions to local problems. Another problem is a problem in a next door town or next door city might be slightly different, but also people in a neighbouring city want to develop their own solutions and their own ways of working, so that they don't always want to accept knowledge from other people. And yet the purpose of a lot of science is to produce knowledge that's generalizable, and I kind of using quotes there to kind of hint at that sort of positivist way of thinking about things. Nathan says researchers do not necessarily have the networks or skills in influencing to ensure their research is acting on it, and yeah, exactly. So practitioners, professionals have networks, and making evidence work in practice often requires input from those networks. So I think that's a really good comment. So there's problems with this way of looking at things, and yet a lot of I mentioned impact is a big agenda for universities, and I think critically that universities still have this idea that universities are the knowledge producers, and it's fed out into practice or shared with policymakers or practitioners. Sue said, do you think there are downsides to co-production? Yep, I'm definitely going to come back to that later, so hold that thought, please. Have I missed any comments? I think I've got most of the comments there. So great, thanks for your comments and thoughts on that. So yeah, we've already identified some of the challenges of implementation or impact, and we'll start to look at addressing those. So I thought this might be a good time to start discussing some of these things in smaller groups, and I'm going to try and do a breakout session now. Let's see, we've got, is that someone asking a question? I'm going to try and automatically assign you to, so you've got about 5 or 6 people in a group, maybe 7. Great. Okay, I'm going to automatically divide you into groups. Probably you remember this from last time if you're in the last session. And what I'd like you to do is discuss these comments on the screen now. I'll try and copy them into your chat in a minute. But that first question I asked you about whether you're involved in research or whether you're a practitioner. So the question here is, in this sort of simple way of looking at things, do you feel you're a knowledge producer or are you a knowledge user? And I know that's an oversimplification, but just for the purpose of this discussion, maybe you can tell others in your group whether you're one or the other, and a bit about your work on that. And then after you've had a bit of a chat about that, then discuss how your interest, how you argue the case for your interest, whether that's the topic that you want to do some research on or are doing research, or whether you've got a question from practice that you want to be researched. So how do you sort of argue the case for your particular topic of interest? So I'll try and drop into the groups and kind of make that clear if it's not clear. But we'll go into those breakout rooms, and I'll give you 10 minutes. Hopefully that will get you started. We can extend that a bit if we need to. And then I'll bring you all back together and we'll have a bit of feedback. And go through a bit more of the sort of complexity of evidence or different types of evidence as well. So coming on to how we might think of evidence as a construct, and how evidence is constructed within clinical research as a broad term. I don't know how many, I guess most of you are aware of this kind of pyramid of evidence that's often discussed. And the idea behind this is that different types of evidence, different methods, have a different kind of value in terms of how we can use them. In terms of, this puts forward this idea that the kind of weakest evidence is anecdote, a story from a practitioner who's experienced this type of or treated this kind of condition and this happened, such and such happened. Going through the more experimental methods, case control study, and with randomized controlled trials near the top, because those are kind of seen as the gold standard of experimental research. And then finally with this systematic review, i.e. pooling lots of data from lots of experiments together to end up with one summary sort of answer. Now that's, as we were just talking about, generalizable. That's very good in terms of making knowledge generalizable. But in doing that, data or information or evidence is kind of extracted from context, if you see what I mean. Context is more or less stripped out in finding the single generalizable answer in terms of an odds ratio or risk relative risk of a systematic review. Similarly with cost benefit data, etc. So as social scientists, we might call this whole approach a positivist approach, that this objective idea of objective science. So the key point of putting these in this order is that we think that the top of the pyramid is the most trustworthy evidence, and that comment about is this particular practice worth doing. So policymakers or commissioners have to base their evidence on where to put their money, and they want to do that on the best evidence, and this is the way of looking at this. But where does qualitative research fit into this pyramid? I can't see it on there at all. So if anyone has any ideas of where qualitative research fits in, then type it into the chat or shout out, because I don't see it in there at all. So that's a bit of a problem to me, and it sort of identifies this disparity that we have between this kind of positivist idea and the importance of qualitative evidence. I'll move on to this slide, and this is where have I gone now? Because I'm on Twitter all the time and following all the COVID debates, it's really fascinating to see these debates going on in the news and social media. And the debates are about data and about evidence and research and policy. These are just two examples of the mask debate. So Professor Trish Greenhalgh has summarised a lot of the evidence and is very supportive of wearing masks and face coverings. And on the other hand, Professor Robert Dingwall, a local in Nottingham, is very critical and highlights the sometimes unrealised risks of wearing masks and problems. And that they talk about slightly different evidence. That they talk about RCTs stands for randomised controlled trials, experimental studies. So for example, Trish Greenhalgh talks about the evidence of physical science about how masks stop spread of COVID, whereas Robert Dingwall talks about, well, how do mask wearing, how does that shape in society? How does it actually happen? What if we touch our mask and then we touch our face and that causes a contamination? All these kind of problems of the real world. Now, it's very difficult to do an experiment or trial about mask wearing because, you know, how would you do that? So these are some of the problems with that pyramid that we just looked at. It doesn't necessarily give us information on what we need information on for COVID, for mask wearing. There aren't any trials or large significant trials of mask wearing preventing COVID. So these are quite difficult questions to address with that pyramid of knowledge. So the knowledge pyramid doesn't always work, and qualitative research doesn't fit into there. And the point I'm trying to sort of get across in this way is that different evidence has different value to different people. Different policymakers use different evidence in different ways, and this evidence-based medicine or evidence-based practice is quite a specific discourse, if you like. It's quite a specific way of valuing evidence. So I'll just bring you back to this slide that I showed in my qualitative presentation, and there are different aspects of quality of care identified by the Institute of Medicine. Now, effectiveness is the second one there, and efficiency is in there as in costs and efficiency, but there's lots of other things as well, and many of these aren't amenable to a randomised controlled trial. Some of them are much more, patient-centeredness, for example, is much more amenable to qualitative approaches. So the point that I'm trying to get towards here is that the problem that we've identified and then the methods that we use to explore that problem then affect how we put that into practice, or working back the other way, if we've got a problem, a kind of policy problem, how do we produce the evidence that policymakers will find useful to address that problem? So what I'm trying to get it out in a sort of roundabout way is it's a two-way process. It's not a straightforward, here's the evidence, let's put it into practice. So I thought I'd go back to one of the articles that we talked about in the qualitative session, and this was this article about vaccination. So keeping on the COVID theme. So this was about understanding people's perspective and misinformation about COVID vaccination. So how might this fit into some of these challenges that we've been discussing? What this group found and we showed in the qualitative session is some of the problems that are identified within the community. One of the concerns was that people feel that they're like guinea pigs, and that scientists with their vaccination is a bit like testing on guinea pigs in the population. So there's a feeling of sort of being under the control of scientists, or being surveilled. So understanding that perspective makes you think, okay, to implement that or to put that into practice, that might be about communicating, it might be about public awareness, about transparency, about how the vaccine was developed, about transparency from the scientists, about communicating from their perspective. What the tradition, if you like, the traditional side of the vaccine implementation is that you develop the vaccine, you do an RCT of the vaccine, and then you put it into practice, and that's what's, you know, the rollout of the vaccine has followed that course, if you like. So I'm giving it the alternative here in that if with this qualitative evidence that we've got, that people are suspicious, have concerns, we need to, or it's best if we can start to address those concerns and work on people's understanding people's fears, mitigating those fears and concerns, rather than just doing a blanket rollout, so to speak. And by that I mean, you know, people getting the sack if they don't get their vaccination. That's quite a linear kind of way of thinking, that we've got the vaccine, people must have it, therefore we've got to you know, take people out of employment if they don't receive the vaccine. Whereas this qualitative study has uncovered another, provides evidence that a different way of implementing should be explored as well. So as I said, this is about health beliefs and trust. It's not just about implementing a vaccine or rolling out a vaccine. So that's then a bit about implementation of that research study, and I'll just come on to this to remind you of this figure that I also showed in the previous session. Now, all the research that you've discussed, or your practice that you may have discussed in your breakouts, again, does it relate to individuals, to patients, to populations? Does it relate to your service, or does it relate to how practitioners work together, how professionals work together? So there's different aspects there, and that will relate to your research, but then thinking how to implement evidence into those different topic areas. So for example, if you want to implement a change in practice, that might be about working with professionals to understand their professional values, understand how professionals work together. That's quite a different type of implementation than, you know, as I said, implementing a vaccine, rolling out a vaccine to a population. So different types of evidence might be needed, different ways of implementing might be needed. I'm also going to come on to this kind of research cycle idea, in terms of this is again coming back to that first idea of identifying a problem and then using a scientific method to explore it and come up with recommendations. But here we're going around in a circle, and we sort of acknowledge that we come back to the beginning and identify a new problem potentially and work on that problem. So again, implement, we've certainly got disseminate on this slide, and we've got implement as well. So there's an awareness that research activity is a sort of life cycle that includes implementation and feeds back into the research agenda. So it's again, it's kind of not just one way, but it's more cyclical. So having gone through those slides, I'm going to do another breakout session, and hopefully you'll be in the same groups that you were before, and continue some of your discussions about what kind of evidence might you need in terms of implementing in your particular area of interest. Or another question is, what stage of the research implementation cycle are you currently in, and what's the next step, or how can you, or alternatively, if you're sort of new to research, do you know of any research that's ongoing in your area of interest, and what stage of the research cycle is a project, and how might you sort of join that research cycle? If that's reasonably clear to everyone, then I'll send you into your breakout rooms. And any questions? So where was I? Yeah, so this piece of work looked at the experience of home care workers for people with dementia, and by my colleagues Justine Schneider and others. And just to say that some of the topics that were explored, we touched on in the last session, and some of the theory that they developed and worked on within that study. So what I'm getting at now is, okay, how was that then put into practice, or how might it be put into practice? This is just published last year, so we haven't gone that far down the road, so to speak. But already Justine is excellent at putting things into different media. So this she's developed an opera based on the findings from this study called Take Care. This is going to be put on at Lakeside Arts Centre at University of Nottingham. So this is a great example of using different media to convey some of the findings of a research study, and obviously reach a broader audience in a different way, not black and white paper and not in a journal, but different ways that can, reach emotions and reach different parts. Several years ago, Justine did another study on care homes, and this was similarly put into a play, and they actually arranged busloads of care workers to come to see the play, and also to have some workshop sessions after the play to reflect on their feelings and experiences. So this is a great way of doing things that Justine manages to put these activities on. So it's a really good example of a different way of communicating. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up really with some different approaches rather than this straightforward linear approach that I started with. And one thing that people have talked about is patient involvement, patient and public involvement, PPI as we might call it, involving stakeholders, etc. And sometimes that linear approach of, as we started off with, knowledge producers, knowledge users, isn't helpful because it creates divisions, it creates divides, barriers. And maybe more modern approaches or more recent approaches include ways of engaging those knowledge users, so to speak, in the research process itself. And two examples that I'm going to show here are participatory action research and quality improvement. Very different methods, but involve this kind of breakdown of those divisions. So participatory research or community-based research is about working with members of the community, whether members of the public or practitioners, really getting them involved in the process of the research themselves. So it's not the case that the academic plans the research, but the academic may facilitate the community get together, and the community identify the problem, the community identify some solutions to that problem, and it carries on in that way, in that sort of what we might call co-production, co-design. These kind of terms are very popular at the moment. That's quite radical in the sense of the conventional idea of research, and it's far from the idea of objective or positivist research. The advantage is that the solution or the outcomes, the findings, are really integrated in the community, in the context within which the problem has been identified, within which the work has been done. And that's kind of the opposite of what happens as we started off with that linear model, where the solution, the evidence is kind of extracted out of all of that contextual information. And that in itself creates a barrier to then putting that evidence back into practice. Whereas some of these approaches, the solution is much more embedded in the context of the community or the service, if we're talking about health services, for example. Quality improvement has some similarities, but it's more sort of professionally orientated, more service orientated, and it's about, again, a much more bottom-up approach, with practitioners identifying problems and going through a mini cycle, if you like, of this research process, and often encapsulated by this PDSA cycle. So trying to address iteratively, if you like, small problems and small solutions, test how they work, and importantly, monitor changes over time. And it's quite often done with monitoring quantitative measures, so a kind of some kind of measure of service quality, and then measuring that over time, and hoping to identify improvements and continue to the next phase. So that's different approaches that combine, if you like, implementation and research, or break down the barriers between them. So I think that's where I'll leave it for today. Just to remind you, key points that I've tried to talk about is planning for impact at the beginning of your project. Consider which approach might work best to engagement and implementation, and try and think about how your evidence is shaping up. Are you collecting the right type of evidence to really be able to move that into practice? And of course, involve patients and public as early as possible in the process, and other stakeholders.